We'll bring this. It is 6:03 p.m. and we will bring the city council work session to order. We only have one item on our agenda tonight. That is the 58 Nall tax abatement request with Laura Smith.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So we've been talking a lot over the course of the last several months about two pending requests for tax abatement that we've had from developers. And as a result of that, we've spent several months kind of looking at and revising and updating our tax abatement policy, which was written in or approved in 2007, hadn't been used since then. And so we, in July, adopted a tax abatement policy that was more reflective of sort of the goals and objectives that the council had, and helped make it maybe clear for us as we evaluate and for potential developers. Kind of behind the scenes, working in that direction, we've been working with Mr. Moffit and his team to kind of collect the information that goes into the cost benefit analysis that is required from us by the IRB statutes, as well as a variety of different things. And I think we're positioned to potentially bring that forward as an action item in October, but we wanted to get in front of you because this is a new process for all of us this evening to just kind of tell you where we are, have an opportunity for you around real numbers and a real project to sort of understand how tax abatement works. I'm still learning in that process. And then be able to answer any questions or respond to requests for information that you all might have prior to kind of moving this to its final stage for council consideration. So we have Mr. Pete Heaven, our land use attorney, here in person this evening, who can certainly answer questions. Bruce Kimmel, financial advisor, is participating virtually. He will have a PowerPoint presentation here shortly to walk us through. Kevin Wimpy with Gilmore and Bell was unable to be here this evening. He's been involved in the preparation of these documents, and he will be available next week at the committee meeting. We have Mr. Moffit, who I think most of you are familiar with, and then his counsel, Chris Klein, to answer questions. So I asked Brian to provide some renderings of the project just to kind of refresh our memories about where it is and what it looks like. There we go. So thank you, Mr. Moffit. And so really, I mean, as you know, but really for Mr. Moffit and Mr. Klein's benefit, the work session, even though we're seated this way, it's a little bit more informal opportunity for back and forth and exchange of information and questions. So the mayor will still chair that, but it's not as formal as maybe a committee meeting or certainly our legislative meeting. So that's kind of the history of where we are. We're talking about a 3-story, 77-unit apartment project located at the corner of 58th Street and Nall Avenue. I think initially we will begin and ask Mr. Kimmel to sort of highlight the information that was provided in his memo that was in the packet, kind of looking at that threshold, the anticipated need for incentives. And then he will also do a review of the cost benefit analysis. That's something that you all haven't seen because it hasn't been required. It's not a requirement in a TIF project. He has a PowerPoint, which I handed out to you to just kind of talk through the component pieces of that. And then Pete and I can certainly hit the high points of an anticipated performance agreement. So in the case of a tax abatement, when we do a TIF project, you all are familiar with redevelopment agreements that we work on. It essentially becomes the contract between the city and the developer and outlines all of the specific applicable cost sharing or revenue sharing, other things that are required. In the case of a tax abatement, it's a performance agreement, not a redevelopment agreement. It's just the terminology, many of the same provisions, but we will kind of hit those high points. And then certainly along the way, if you have questions, and I know you will, stop any of us and ask those, but be happy to try to answer whatever we can, recognizing that it's a little bit of uncharted territory for all of us. So with that, I'm going to ask Mr. Kimmel, if you would, to kind of kick us off.
All right. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Mayor and Council. Bruce Kimmel with Ellers. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm in a little bit of a remote location, but I will speak up and hopefully my voice will travel all the way to Mission. So as Laura mentioned, we did a pretty thorough pro forma analysis of the numbers that were provided by the developer in terms of their development budget, their operating pro forma, their rent roll, their financing assumptions, basically all of the components that contribute to a return on investment. And we looked at the project both with and without different levels of tax abatement. It became apparent pretty quickly from looking at the numbers. Okay, great. So we looked at the numbers and we determined that without level assistance, the project will need to achieve a cash on cash rate of return of approximately 8%, which is really below the sort of more market rate of return of 10 to 12% for a project of this sort. And then with abatements of roughly 70 to 80%, you would get into the 10 to 12% rate of return, as I noted in the memo that I believe you all have.
I think I'm gonna have him call me and we'll just put him on speaker.
I don't know why this is, but my Zoom seems to be okay. I will switch over to Laura's phone.
Okay, I'm gonna put you on speakerphone and put the mic down to my phone. All right, let's try this.
All right. Yeah, I'm not sure what was happening with the Zoom, but this is loud and clear for me. So as I was noting, and hopefully you heard before I blanked out a couple times there, our analysis did show a but-for need for some level of assistance in order to achieve a market rate of return. And then we also looked with city staff at your policy that was adopted earlier this year. And that, by applying the baseline criteria as well as some of the adjustments, as you know, pointed towards the appropriateness or the applicability of a 70% abatement. So in this case, what we were kind of looking at from the but-for analysis perspective happened to coincide with what was indicated by the policy in terms of supporting or providing a rationale for a 70% level of abatement for 10 years. As I noted in the memo, that won't always be the case. We expect that there will be some projects where there is a greater need for assistance than perhaps the policy would indicate. And so the city will need to consider that and decide whether to deviate from policy. And conversely, there might be a project that scores well on the policy, but just doesn't really show as much need for assistance. And so that also would be a reason to deviate downward and really rely more on the but-for side of things in terms of deciding what level of assistance to provide. But why don't I stop there and see if you have any questions regarding the memo and the finding of a 70% abatement for this project.
Do we have any questions for Bruce just on this piece? Yeah, Ken?
Bruce, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. I would like to have a little discussion about the way in which we have added percentages above the baseline and what the criteria is and how that criteria has been essentially influenced by, the process for adding up to 70% abatement from the 45 baseline. I have specific questions about the adjustment for target area because I don't think that the council has really talked about the target area adjustment. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about the attainment of housing adjustment because I believe that we had hoped for 20% rather than a 10% portion of the building that would be for attainable housing, and why we granted the full 10% added to that abatement level. So those are the kinds of questions I'd like us to discuss because this is the first time we've really applied this baseline plus in our discussion.
Mr. Kimmel, would you like me to take a first pass at that?
Sure, that
Okay.
would be fine.
Okay. So exactly in line with what you've just said, Councilmember Davis, we drafted this policy and then you go to apply it the first time and you find things that maybe would change going forward, or how do we want to interpret this? So obviously, in this case, we established criteria, it had to be at least a $3 million project to be considered at all for tax abatement, and a minimum capital investment of 10 million to really kick us into any of those additional percentage categories. The policy also gave discretion to the council to make any of the additional percentage criteria mandatory on any given project. And so what had been communicated to me from you all was that you wanted the attainable housing and the sustainability components to be mandatory criteria as a part of that consideration. And I think from the time that from our initial conversations with Mr. Moffit and his team and discussions at the preliminary development plan approval stage, we've had a lot of conversations around all of those issues. So I think pretty straightforward. When you look at section 4 of the policy, the project investment adjustment is just based on the capital investment. And so they qualify for that 5% there. Target area is tricky. And we've had a lot of conversations internally about what is a target area. Would there be an area in our community that wouldn't be a target area for development? Maybe, maybe not. If we look at, I think our recommendation here of an abatement of up to 10%, if we're looking at parcels that are vacant, if we're looking at, and depending on the length of time, not all of these have been vacant for the same period of time as some of the buildings in our community. But I think what we've seen with Script Pro's willingness and desire to sell off portions of their campus, looking at an opportunity to redevelop an area that could potentially sit vacant for some period of time. It is that next tier off of the Johnson Drive corridor. So it fits in sort of nicely with trying to bring more residential and connect it to the walkability components of the community. It also, because of the size and scale of the project, helps to create a transition there in that area, particularly between this project and the single family homes than to the north. So I think for those reasons, at least we felt in our initial, and again, this is our staff recommendation, ultimately the council's decision. And that's why we gave 10% for that criteria. Obviously, job
Sorry, we
creation.
gave 5, right?
Oh, 5.
Or-
I'm sorry. Yes,
yeah,
5.
Out of up to 10.
Up to 10. We gave half of that. Nothing for job creation. attainable housing, an abatement adjustment of up to 10%. I think the rationale there was, we had asked on the residents at Rock Creek project for 20%. When you look at the size and the scale of the project and the impact on the financials of that requirement, would 10%, is that sort of scalable on a 77 unit project versus what, Brian, what's residents on Rock Creek, 170-ish? So I think that was kind of the criteria about, I mean, 20% of 77 units is a lot greater. So trying to kind of keep that scalable, that we may not have that right yet, right? That was the rationale. And then environmental design, what we've realized is the way the policy is currently written, this abatement adjustment shall range from 5 to 10%. So there's nothing below, right? 5%. And I think in our internal conversations going forward, we probably already have some recommended revisions to this policy, but that's why we gave them the 5%, feeling like that was the floor for that criteria. And they do and have proposed achieving the 1 Globe certification for the project. So the question or the conversations that we've had internally is, so if we're looking at Green Globe system and LEED, there's sort of 4 levels in each one. And so perhaps a revision for the policy going forward might be 2.5% for, base, and upward in each of those systems. You could kind of have a comparable system. One of the other things that we've talked about just in evaluating, and we've done it with on this project and the other one that's sort of in the pipeline, is asking the developer to score themselves against that criteria. And then we've just really engaged in back and forth about what do we think makes sense here. But and I'm certainly happy for Mr. Heaven or Mr. Kimmel to add there, but that was sort of the rationale and how we got to the additional 70%.
Comment with regards to the attainable housing, I would recommend that we do 0.5 per percentage, basically as you go up, so that the ideal would be 20% of the units that would be attainable housing, and that would reach the 10%. But anything else would be based on 0.5%. That would mean that rather than 10% for this, that this particular project would be 5%.
Certainly that's a point for council decision.
My reasoning for that is that I think that this is scalable. I think that the definition should be based on what is best for the city, not what's best to reach an abatement level that the applicant is seeking.
Emily?
The ghost from online. All right. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Sorry, guys. Thank you. I appreciate Councilmember Davis's comments, particularly as it relates to attainable housing, and just in consideration of the environmental design adjustment. I think, and Laura, I totally get kind of figuring this out as we go. I think in my mind, when we adopted this policy, the 5 to 10% based on certification or level of certification really to me was, thinking about LEED certification or something comparable. I think we've heard from some of our friends in the U.S. Green Building Council that Green Globes is just not quite up to that standard because of the self-reporting versus a third party verification. So thinking about, that 5 to 10% is the Green Globes a comparable piece, and is 1 Globe of that standard. I don't know enough about the certification, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about what's involved in that. Because to me, that 5% in my mind was maybe going to be LEED certification at the bronze level, and I just don't know if that 1 Globe is comparable. Just wondering if you all have any thoughts on that.
Well,
Anyone?
I mean, I think that's been a question that we've had for staff is how to weigh green globes. And I'm not sure we still have maybe great information on that. I know I don't know, Emily, if you've looked at it at all or.
Well, I think that Councilmember Thomas's point is accurate and from a self-proclaimed biased source, but also an expert in the field, that Green Globes is just not, the verification is different. And so if you place that stock on that alternative system, you know, whether or not it translates to a different percentage for this project or all projects going forward, I'm not sure we're feeling fully confident in making that determination. But I think from what we can tell, just because, as Councilmember Thomas said, the verification is not as robust or, you know, not third-party verified. And some of the other standards are a bit, I think, less. Well, and I think you can argue the branding of the two programs is different too. So what it provides us in terms of community benefit or awareness or snowball effect for other projects to take it on, et cetera. I don't know if that's lesser too, but like I said, I don't know if it equates honestly to a different percentage. That would be your decision, I guess.
Any other questions for Bruce or staff so far? Seeing none, we want to continue with Bruce back on the phone.
Yes, Bruce, you're back on.
All right, great, thank you. So one thing I thought might be helpful would be just to put together a brief PowerPoint. And this is something that we can elaborate on. Frankly, this is a brand new thing that we pulled together just in the last day or two to try to help explain some of the components that are part of the cost benefit analysis that was prepared by Municipal Consulting. I want to note that you didn't have any role in preparing this cost benefit analysis. This is really a specialized service that only a small handful of providers do. And so we weren't part of it, but I thought given the number of numbers and charts and figures in the cost benefit analysis that you'll be seeing, that it might be helpful to lay out some of the key points and percentages that are part of this statutorily required analysis. And so that's the first point that I wanted to make, is that this analysis, this CBA as it's called, is really distinct from the but-for analysis that we did at Ellers. And it's distinct from any and all policy considerations that you as the governing body and your staff would be doing as it relates to this project. The real point of the cost benefit analysis is to estimate and compare the public entity's benefits from a project over a 10-year period and compare those to the estimated costs over that same 10-year period, i.e. the abatement period. One limitation of the cost benefit analysis, and one reason I really don't care for it, frankly, as far as it goes, is it really doesn't show you any of the benefit after the abatement period. In other words, it only compares costs and benefits during the abatement period and doesn't reflect at all any of the upside that the city would be getting from having this approximately 80 unit project paying full taxes thereafter. But that is what is called for in the statutory requirements. And so that's just, again, the nature of the analysis. Going on to the next slide, I wanted to just give you a little bit of a flavor for the benefit cost ratio that Municipal Consulting calculated not only for the city, but for the other taxing entities. And you can see that I provided a very rudimentary example of benefits and costs that added up to an overall ratio of 1.55 on a future value basis, and then on a present value basis added up to 1.49. There shouldn't be a percentage there, by the way. It should just be 1.49. And the reason for that, well, let me just reiterate, as it says on the slide, that anything over a 1 ratio, a positive 1, is a good thing. That means that the benefits are exceeding the costs. And then the higher, the better. And the reason why, in this example I gave you, the reason why the present value ratio is lower than the future value is because present dollars or near-term dollars are worth more under present value than future dollars, right? So there is a discounting involved with the longer out years, and that's why that ratio goes down a little bit. Then on the next slide, another factor or another calculation that's part of this cost benefit analysis is average rate of return. Again, I use the same analysis to come up, or the same number of benefits and costs to come up with a ratio there, or a rate of return. And you can see how it goes from 10% in the first year up to 100% rate of return in the 10th year, with an average of 55% on a future value basis. And please, you can stop me along the way, or I'll also be part of next week's call or discussion, and we can certainly talk more about this then.
Bruce, can I ask a question? Are the numbers
Yeah.
in your slides a hypothetical example? So because these are not the numbers that are for this project,
Yes,
correct?
these are just hypothetical
Okay.
numbers to illustrate how these calculations work.
Great, got it. Thank you.
Yep. So then on the next slide, some of the factors that are involved in the cost benefit or benefit cost analysis would include your mill rate and the taxes generated from that mill rate for this project, the payment in lieu of taxes that you'll be receiving during the abatement term, utility fees and franchise fees, sales tax dollars that would be received, and on a 100% residential project, that is an estimate of the sales taxes that would be generated by residents shopping locally, new residents in the community that are part of the community and shopping in Mission as a result of living in this development. And then on the cost side, the main costs, of course, are the sales tax exemption and the property tax abatement, as well as the cost of providing city services, in the case of the city, city services to the development and the tenants. So then, as you'll see, the numbers vary widely in this analysis, and I don't have complete information on how exactly all of the calculations work, but I can say the reason why some of these numbers vary widely are based on the mill rate differences, the fact that the school district, for instance, has a capital outlay mill rate that is exempt from the tax abatement, so that obviously contributes greatly to their benefit cost ratio, that this part of their tax structure is not part of the tax abatement. The type of utility fees and or franchise fees that might be in place, the sales tax rate that might be in place. Obviously, the city of Mission does benefit from having a sales tax locally, although with this being 100% residential, there isn't a whole lot of sales tax generation there. And then other revenues that might come into play as well. So that's, oh, and then finally, the cost of providing service on a marginal basis. There is a difference, for instance, in the cost of the city providing services to the residents of this project, as opposed to Johnson County providing its services. And their marginal cost is going to be less than it is for the city of Mission, just because Johnson County is such a much larger entity, and the cost of providing their services to this development is therefore going to be a lot less than it would be for the city. So then finally, on the last slide, this is numbers. These are numbers that were taken directly from the cost benefit analysis that you will be seeing. And again, I'll be happy to go into more detail at future discussions. But you can see that the city scores relatively low compared to the other entities. I would point out that these are just percentages and ratios. They're not actual dollars. On an actual dollar basis, you compare pretty well. But just due to the nature of your tax structure versus others and the cost of providing city services, you can see the estimated rate of return and benefit cost ratio for the different taxing entities. Why don't I stop there and ask what questions you might have? I know that this is a brand new topic, and so I don't know how helpful it would be to get into a lot of detail here tonight, but again, I wanted to introduce this to you. And again, this is something that we can certainly elaborate on at future discussions as well.
Yeah, Ken?
Bruce, this is Ken Davis again. In reading the report, the cost benefit analysis report from Stephen Robb, Municipal Consulting, there's a disclaimer here that basically says that this is relying upon the applicant's information only, right? So there's no real vetting of the information that's being provided other than what the applicant is sharing with the group. Is that interpretation correct?
I don't believe it is. I can't answer that with certainty, council member, but I believe that Mr. Robb did actually consult multiple other sources to populate the data table that his model uses in doing some of the calculations, such as sales tax generation, franchise fee generation, some of the other things that he did that were specific to the city of Mission. I'm sure there were parts of it relative to the project cost. That's a big part of it that did come from the applicant, but I think that disclaimer maybe is broader than it actually should be. But that is something that we can check and get back to you on.
I do agree with your point that this is only during the 10-year period and there's no factoring in what happens beyond that in terms of the impact for the city. And I think that that's something that is bothersome, that we don't have any real sense of what is the overall impact in terms of cost benefit for the city in this beyond the 10-year period.
Well, I think if we think about it like we have thought about TIF projects, where after the TIF ends, you're going to get all of the revenue. So the benefit will increase after that time. Bruce, would that be your take when you were
Yes,
referencing
that's
that?
Let me speak to that disclaimer. And I think the developers can also, attest. They are in contact with Municipal Consulting, and they provide project costs and information on jobs created and a variety of different things. So there's a certain number of inputs that come from them. But the majority of the inputs in this table are something that Mr. Robb goes out and pulls down. So for example, we'd run an earlier iteration of this, and in kind of a review, I realized Consolidated Fire District number 2 hadn't been factored into this, right? And so he will go out and he will look at the taxing entities' websites. He tracks down the information from a variety of different sources. So he's using that. Much of that data is coming from other sources that he taps into frequently, whether he's running a cost benefit analysis for the city of Mission or the city of Olathe or Overland Park. So it's probably less dependent on the variables that the developer provides than those other sort of economic factors that he looks at as he calculates that in accordance and to kind of meet the statutory requirements of that. The other thing in thinking about, we will have this number, we've been working to try to be able to provide it tonight. One of the challenges that we've had, you may recall that property was 4 separate parcels that were replatted into one. We go through that process. I can't now go out to Ames and pull down the previous year's tax bills. What we want to be able to illustrate to you, we'd hope to do that tonight. We'll figure out how to make sure you have it next week, is here's what those properties were generating previously in terms of revenue coming to the city. And here's what, for the 10 years of abatement, right, that we would at 30% that will still be coming to us with the improved value, what that number will be. So I think that's, I would like to see that number and really be able to wrap my head around that number. And I think that's, as we've gone through the policy development, that's something I've understood you all to really, that helps. What are we getting today? If we're not giving 100% abatement, what will we get over 10 years? And then what at the expiration of that abatement period, could we expect that? And those, and I think it's referenced in there. So stormwater utility fees or any other special assessments are not subject to the abatement process. So we're trying to track down the previous year's tax bills and be able to give you that side by side, obviously estimated, but comparison, because I think that will be really helpful.
Laura, is that something that we think the developers team would have despite the replat? I don't know if you all can answer that.
We don't have it here today.
Okay. Yeah, I do think because our policy, and I don't have the exact language pulled up, talks about that we won't be in a sort of worse tax perspective than the current status quo, that would be an important figure, before we're heading into next meeting, if we can get that piece resolved. Okay, any other questions at this stage? Yeah, Debbie?
I have a Pete question. Because this is different and I may have missed something. I need a better legal framework of what entails. Mr. Moffit has his property for 3 years and sells. How does the tax abatement go with the property, with the owner? How does the tax abatement work with if the property is sold?
It follows the land, so the new owner would get the benefit of the abatement.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions?
No, that's it.
Okay.
I
Yeah,
have a
Leah?
follow-up question on that. I thought I read somewhere that if it were to be put up for sale, the city would have some input on that. Did I misread or?
That's sounding right from our policy, but I can't remember what section it is now. Sorry, what, Brian? Oh,
Transfers. You have your policy at section 3, transfer of ownership.
We have the right to approve that assignment, obviously. And if we don't approve the assignment, then the abatement would go away.
yeah, and it says such consent may be denied or subject to additional conditions or abatement adjustments in the city's sole discretion, unless it's a parent or affiliate or related entity of the developer. So you remembered right, Leah. Any other questions at this stage? Seeing none, I don't know if Bruce has more for us, if we're on to the next piece.
Bruce, anything else you would add?
Not at this time, but I will sit tight and pipe in as necessary.
Laura, who's up next?
Okay, so next in your the memo from me that was included in the packet, just a lot of background and history on the policy, how we got to where we were. If you go to page 4 of that memo, we'll kind of run through some of the key highlights that you could anticipate being included in a draft performance agreement for this project and really any other project that you might consider for tax abatement. So in this case, we're illustrating, at least based on the percentage calculated to date, the city and all other impacted taxing entities would receive 30% of the taxes due. And 70% of the taxes then would be abated in accordance with the performance agreement over that 10-year period. We touched on the tax abatement does not apply to special assessments, specifically in our case, our stormwater utility fee. So as we still consider there may be a recalculation of impervious surface based on the new building and rooftop and parking area. But a stormwater utility fee would still be assessed to that property. Additionally, the school district's capital outlay levy of not to exceed 8 mils is exempted from the abatement. The city and the developer would agree to a schedule for commencement and completion of the project. Failure of the developer to actually commence or complete in accordance with that schedule would constitute an event of default. Similar to the provision, if we're looking at attainable housing, we want to talk about the length of time and a mix of units, which we haven't discussed specifically. But the units would be split between studio, 1 bedroom and 2 bedrooms, similar to what kind of the terms included in the residents on Rock Creek agreement. And that the developer then annually would be required to report to the city that those information on those attainable housing units. One of the things that we, you may recall that was a concern that was raised with the residents on Rock Creek was what happens to people who maybe get into an attainable unit towards the end of the TIF period in that case, but the abatement period in this case. And so some desire to sort of insulate against this rent shock. And so we've would imagine that we would include a term that would sort of deal with that similarly. Again, so then something in the performance agreement addressing the sustainability piece. We will have obviously a section about what constitutes the various things that might constitute an event of default and an applicable cure period. Typically, we see that being a 60-day or long, depending on the event of default, the city and the developer could agree on a longer cure period. Any payments due under the agreement, so those payments in lieu of taxes, if they were not to be paid, would be then due and bear interest at the interest rate imposed by Kansas law on overdue ad valorem taxes. And then, and I think this goes to a point that I believe Councilmember Kring has raised before, that in the performance agreement, it requires the developer to acknowledge that other projects may receive better or worse consideration for a term of a performance agreement. And as a condition of entering into this agreement, they waive any claim that they might have against us if you wanted to negotiate something different. And I know that's something we've heard consistently. If we do it this for one, are we on the hook to do the same thing for everyone else? And the answer is no. We've talked a lot about discretion, but the performance agreement would specifically include that acknowledgement by the developer. What did I miss, Mr. Haddon? Okay, I'm finished. Should have told me to sit down.
We need to take a step back. No, you did a great job. I checked off all the things on my list that you covered. I appreciate that. A performance agreement is a development agreement light. And the reason for it, it's a much shorter document because with a development or a redevelopment agreement, we're actually administering funds for construction, TIF, CID, all of the benefits that you're aware of now. This is sort of the inverse. We don't get involved in the construction. We're giving a tax abatement. And that tax abatement doesn't begin until the project's completed. So what we're doing now is we're setting in motion with a resolution of intent to issue bonds in the future, a scheme whereby Mr. Moffit can get a tax abatement for up to 10 years at the completion, when he satisfied us that he's built the way we've required him to be built, the project to be built, then he gets his abatement. So it's a little bit different situation than we've had in the past. We're going to wait until he's finished before we issue our bonds. Those bonds will be purchased by him. They don't go through an underwriter. They aren't purchased by the general public. And the term of the bonds can be up to 10 years. The term is up to you all. We also, in a typical performance agreement, we will have adjustments to the pilot, which is the payment in lieu of taxes. In this case, staff is recommending 30%. If certain things are not done during construction or certain levels or what we call credits are not achieved, that number will go down, or I'm sorry, it will go up because they're not doing what we've asked them to do. So the performance agreement is really sort of an agreement whereby we say, if you build it and you build it the way we have anticipated you'll build it, you will get bonds at the end. And that's the reason it's a much simpler agreement. We also have maintenance obligations set forth that during the tax abatement period, the owner has to maintain the property at a certain level that we require. And everything else will work covered very well. So I'll answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, Trent?
Pete, do you have an assessment on why this mechanism is now kind of appearing before us when TIF has usually been the vehicle of choice for developers in the past? Do you have any sort of insight on that?
There are lots of factors involved. Most people don't realize TIF benefits are taxable. So when you get $1 of TIF increment, you pay 30 cents for it. And it becomes a more favorable comparison when you look at the taxability of TIF to a tax abatement where you're not paying anything. So those dollars go a little bit further, but it depends on the project. It also depends upon TIF eligibility. And we have TIF districts basically on the south side of Johnson Drive, a little bit on the north side, but I don't think this is in an existing TIF district and it wouldn't qualify. So there are lots of factors. Sure.
Can you come up to the microphone? Sorry, for our online people.
Chris Klein with Hush Blackwell. So I'd also add just that for this project, we have no retail sales. And that's a big component of a TIF district. So that's one reason why we went the abatement route versus a TIF.
Anything else for Pete? Thanks, Pete.
Good to see you all.
Anything else on the agenda?
Any questions?
I don't know.
Discussion, is there anything you want to hear from the developer?
What, was there anything that the developers team wanted to present or to just be available to answer questions?
I think for the most part, we're just going to be here to answer any questions that you all may have, but I did want to just briefly touch on one point. Our
Sure.
question I was asked earlier, and that was like, what type of verification was made for the numbers that were provided for the cost benefit analysis? So those numbers that we provide for that analysis are the same figures that we would have given to Bruce Kimmel, and that would be our budget, our pro forma, things like that. And in Bruce's report that's included in your packet here, he does identify how he reviewed those and that they are comparable and they are in line with what he would have anticipated for the market as well. So that is the verification. Any of the other figures that would have been used in that cost benefit were not ones that the developer provided. So
That's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, Ken?
I'd just like to make a general comment. First of all, thank you very much for being here and for providing the information that we have as part of this process. I do appreciate the fact that this is the first opportunity for us as a council to really look at a policy that we've adopted and how it really comes into play in terms of its implementation. I do think that there's some elements of it that we need to fine tune from the standpoint of what council's policy is going to be. But I think that based on what we've done, the applicant has certainly come forward with a reasonable request. I think that we as a council need to determine whether or not these percentages that have been applied are in fact what we want to have applied, and how does it really measure up to the incentive that we're willing to give for the things that we're going to get out of it. Thank you.
Any other final council comments, questions, discussion?
Mayor, can you hear?
Sorry, was that Ben online? Yeah, Ben? Ben, did you have a question?
Yeah, can you all hear me okay?
A little?
I'll type my comment in chat.
No, you're good. You're good
We can
now.
hear you.
Now we can
Okay.
hear you.
Just some general observations. I did agree with others that we ought to take a look at the affordable attainable housing component and see if that's scaling appropriately according to our goals for that. I think this is just based on personal reading. I know staff will do more on this front, but I think the green globes and LEED, both valid systems. I think I would prefer to see like 2 or 3 globes before we start to kick in on the environmental portion of the abatement. And again, that's just from what I've been reading online a bit. And then my last comment is I'm a big fan of this particular area in terms of target area. I think it's that sort of this entire corridor is one of our most important areas. So I would be okay with going up on the sort of target area adjustment to whatever our limit is or closer to it. And that's pretty much all I had to say.
Okay, thank you, Ben. And just for reference, the target area given, I think here, proposed here is 5%, and the target area can be up to 10% per our policy. Okay. Any other final comments or questions? Seeing none, that concludes our work session. Thank you, everybody.